Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Itential Tracking Infrastructure Access for Audit Requirements webinar. My name is Dan Sullivan. I'm a Principal Solutions Architect here at Itential. I've been with Itential for about a little over 4 years, and I've been working in customer-facing roles in pre- and post-sales, focused on automation for about the past 12 plus years. My background is in software development, distributed systems, and networking. Here at Itential, I spend a fair amount of time working with financial institutions, banks, healthcare providers, other large enterprise and service provider Itential customers, and pre and post sales. Recently, I've had some pretty interesting conversations with multiple customers, and it largely has been around auditing. I think in the past, auditing was a more simple process than it is today. So today, it's not enough to show, who did what and when they did it. When you provisioned a firewall policy or an AWS security group. But usually you periodically need now to answer the question of, hey, is that access or that firewall policy still needed? Should it still be in place? Have the business requirements for why we did that, why we provided access still in place, or has that changed and we now need to remove that? I think ITSM systems, while they are great for processing, change requests and implementing approvals, it winds up fairly unwieldy to try to go back and search through a ton of tickets and things like that to try to figure out what you did a year ago or whatever when you're going through some sort of an audit. Ideally, you'd like to have some sort of state that you could track around what you've done and when you did it, why you did it, and you want that accessible to help drive the process. I've spoken with a couple of different customers who do things like, they have processes in place, for example, to go in and look at their firewall rules and see which rules have hits on them. And then after some amount of time, the firewall rules that have been not being hit for a period of time, they'll actually remove. Of course, something like that actually only gets you part of the way there. The reality is that you also have to answer the question, should that rule be in place? I mean, if you're providing access to some external system, but some external system or external business or entity, maybe you shouldn't have that rule in place. There might be traffic flowing over. People might still be consuming resources in your network or your servers or things like that, or access to applications, but maybe they shouldn't be. So now it becomes really interesting to try to figure out how to track state so that a particular service or access can easily be decommissioned after a specific time, or because it's no longer in the company's interest to leave that in place. So today's demo will focus on how the Itential platform and Itential Lifecycle Manager can provide needed state and integration capabilities that help modern enterprises solve these sorts of challenges in their networks today. We have a few slides to go through before we jump into it, but we'll take a look here. And again, hey, security is getting more complicated by the day. I'm sure many of you know that much and live that every day. So from a demo perspective, we are going to have some services to provision infrastructure access, right? And we're going to track that via our Lifecycle app. So we'll be able to provide access with duration so that we can limit the amount of time a given access is provided, and we'll even have a way to validate that it's still required, and we'll do that through ServiceNow. And we'll be able to demonstrate how we can automatically delete that on expiry. So now we're going to have a little bit of state, basically, that we're going to keep about what we do, and we'll have a record of that. And we'll, of course, use our integrations. The Itential platform has integrations with ServiceNow and specifically with AWS. I'll point out that, today we're doing a demo with AWS, but really I think the patent itself is what's more interesting. So for today's demo, we'll focus on provisioning access to a few fictitious applications for external customers, whether it's people or other systems, and we'll cover the basics of what we're doing, which is, exposing an application or system deployed in AWS VPC, and we'll provide access simply by creating some ingress and egress rules and security groups. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that. Typically, maybe you're using an AWS WAF, or maybe you're provisioning changes in your on-prem firewalls. Maybe you're using some other cloud-based product, like out there. But I think the patent is what's kind of interesting. I'm sure you've all seen plenty of demos provisioning firewall rules, so there's no great secret there. So, but again, I think the patent and what we're doing today will maybe be a little bit more interesting. So with that, I'm just going to share my screen. All right. So this is the Itential automation platform. Some of the key applications we'll talk about today will be Lifecycle Manager and Operations Manager. So that will be sort of the primary part of what we're going to demo today. Over here, you see in the middle of the screen are kind of projects, Itential projects, and that's where I've sort of done some of the work pulling this together. And I have a project that I created called Access Service Validation. So if I just click into this project here, see, it'll bring it right up on the screen. You'll see that we have a number of folders over here. So just a way that we can organize the work that we do, all the workflows, transformations, Ginger2 templates, all those things can be sort of organized in one workspace. And I actually have that configured so that as I make changes, I can store them in GitLab or GitHub. In my case, I have a GitLab repo that I'm storing everything in. So it's a pretty easy way to build use cases out and then store them. You'll see that there's a number of folders here, and so we'll take a look at a few of them. And the first thing I'm going to do is click on the services folder here. And what I have here is a number of different services that I'm going to be able to provision. So there'll be access to an Oracle database, access to a Jira application, and access to some fictitious web app that I have. And in this case here, what I can do is if I look at this Oracle project here, you'll see on the left is some of the input to the project. And you'll see on the right-hand side, I'm basically I'm using a Ginger2 template to generate some configuration. And at the top level, I can use this top level service to actually tell me what are the underlying services that are going to be involved in the provisioning operation for this Oracle service, for example. And in my case, I'm just going to provision something in AWS. So I'm going to provision an AWS security group. And you'll see here, if you're familiar at all with JSON or Ginger2, you'll see that basically the output here is I've created an array. And this is kind of useful because you'll see down below the AWS SG array that's populated, there's two other arrays that aren't populated. And the reason I did this is because, and I'll show you this in the workflow, but you can use workflows and they can process an array. And so if you have multiple different offerings here, like maybe you need to configure something in Palo Alto or LDAP, if you don't populate the array, then the workflow knows not to do anything. So it's a kind of a good way to avoid some complex business logic sometimes. So I can just generate these templates. Now, each of these top layer templates generates the underlying configuration for any other sort of composite services that make up. So the Oracle service has a component for the AWS security groups. And you'll see as part of the output, I'm actually going to generate this template preference. And this means that I'll tell the underlying AWS portion of the service what template to look at. So essentially, for the Oracle case, the underlying system will know to read this Oracle AWS SG. So I can dynamically pass in different service templates depending on the service type that I'm doing. So if I configure access to my Oracle database, I'll pass in, I'll read this file and I'll pass this information down to the next layer so that it knows what specific AWS config file it should look at. So in this case, it's reading this AWS security group file. So if I click on that, what we're doing in this case here is really just we're going to put all the parameters together. For Oracle, we're going to create multiple input rules and no output rules. So the output rules array is blank, and input rule array has 2 entries. And that again will trigger the underlying workflow. We'll know, hey, I have 2 rules to provision, or I don't have any in the case of the outbound rules. So it's using this sort of data-driven way to organize our services here. Next, we have kind of the AWS security groups, and this is where we're kind of basically just going to provision or delete security rules that we add. So when we provision the service, we'll add them, and when we delete them, we'll just remove them. And so if you look at the security group add workflow, all it's really doing here is calling 2 workflows. One to create a security group ingress rule and one to create an egress rule. And based on those arrays that we just created in the last workflow, it knows, well, I'm going to call, I have 2 rules to configure here, or in this case, I have 1. So if we go back to that add rules workflow, you'll even see here, if you double click on this, you'll see that it's looping. So it takes that array as input and decides how many times it needs to run. Could be 1, or it could be 0, or it could be however many rules we need it to. So if you're doing something more complicated, you probably have multiple security rules. Maybe you're provisioning both your on-prem. Maybe you have a service in which you're configuring VPNs. But you basically can start sort of building out these services, and at least what I did is building them out and defining them in Ginger. Ideally, I might even want to just for ease of use, I define them within Itential, but you could easily define these externally if you wanted, and pull these dynamically from Git. So now I have these functions here to add security rules and delete security rules. None of this is all that complicated, and we're going to use our built-in adapter. So we'll go straight to we have Itential adapter built off of AWS API specifications. So they're basically AWS and a lot of other vendors basically now provide open API specs that you can use. And so we can ingest those dynamically and render out connectivity. And now we just pull these different features onto the canvas. So if I were to look one more at the add ingress rule here, I'm just making this simple API call. I've passed in the data to drive this, and I might access this multiple times or 1 time. And same thing for deleting it. I'm just going to revoke it's called revoke security groups. So not a big deal. And we do the same thing for egress. Pretty simple stuff. But you can imagine sort of taking this and using this as a building block and building out much more complicated services. Now, of course, all these workflows that we're talking about, adding security groups, they're sort of fire and forget. So they don't remember any state. They don't know what they did and when they did it, other than leaving some auditing breadcrumbs around. There's no real state. There's no way for someone to go and dynamically pull and say, oh, you did this or you did that. You would have to go sifting through some logs and things like that to actually figure out exactly what had happened and when it happened. Not terribly convenient way to organize your data, just depending on audit trails and things like that. And so that's where sort of the lifecycle manager application comes in. So the Lifecycle Manager actually allows us to define a model and maintain some state. So I have a collection of workflows that actually are going to interface with the Lifecycle Manager. So the Lifecycle Manager create workflow is kind of what it sounds like. All it does is do the create. So it basically reads the service files, the service configuration files that we showed over here, the top level ones, and then figures out which assets need to be invoked to deploy the service. So pretty cut and dry here. The other thing that it's going to do over here, this particular job is going to go off and schedule some delete and renew events. So when we actually configure some of these instances, we're actually going to be able to give it a duration. So we're going to know how long we want to actually keep this in place. So we're going to have some state with that, and we'll auto schedule a delete so that after that period of time goes by, it'll actually automatically delete if no other action's been taken. We'll also provision what we call a start renewal. So about I think it's 10 days before the service expires, we'll actually configure another trigger so that 10 days before we're actually due to remove this, we'll start a renewal verification process. And what we'll do is we will create an incident in ServiceNow, send some email to the person who requested the service, and then give them the opportunity either to renew the service and extend it, or potentially just delete it, or do nothing and let it be deleted. And so now we're going to take some of the outcomes of what we're doing here and save the state within Lifecycle Manager. So now we'll have an active record of what we're doing. And I won't go into detail on all these particular workflows, but it'll become a little bit more obvious in just a minute when I show you Lifecycle Manager. And then Operations Manager is where we will sort of interface with some of these applications. So if we want to create a new entry, we'll do it from Operations Manager. If we want to delete one, we can do it there as well. And we'll also use that to schedule our automatic deletions and things like that. You'll notice even there's a ServiceNow directory here, and those are where we have workflows to create ServiceNow incidents, update them, and then possibly resolve them. So nothing too crazy there, but just a few workflows to do those sorts of things. So just update an incident and let's see here. And build a payload and create an incident. So we have all those sorts of features here. And now if I sort of quickly jump into Lifecycle Manager here, and I'm going to click on Access Service Provisioning. That's the Lifecycle model that I created. And you'll see here, these are kind of the properties that define our model. So you can express a particular model in JSON schema, and then use that to define the state that you want to keep. So if I click on instances, it'll show me what I have created already. So for example, I've provided the Acme Corporation access to my Oracle database. So if I want to look at what I've done here, look at the properties, it'll show you, okay, this is the endpoint that they're using that I've created. This is my contact at Acme. And I'm the requester, so it's my email. And then I can actually configure duration of how long I expect that I want this service. I think I did it in multiples of 30 days. So once this is provisioned, now it's kind of interesting to see, okay, how is this different than another workflow, any other sort of fire and forget system? So if I go to Operations Manager, which is sort of where we sort of interact with the lifecycle instances, you'll see first here, if I click on the delete model here, where I you'll see here, if I can see in the start renewal, where I actually have the renewal already scheduled for to start. So for one of the systems, I can actually schedule a renewal. So in a couple of the other ones, I didn't have the renewal schedule, but let's try this again. So now if I create one here, so I'll just create one, and I'll call this I'll say it's 90 days, and I'll hit the renew button, so I'll definitely schedule a renewal on this. And we got spacely.com. Maybe it's just a single endpoint or whatever, it doesn't really matter. And so now I'll just run this quickly and let's see what happens. Okay, so it looks like it completed. So if I go back to the Lifecycle tab, I can see that I've actually created that. So that looks pretty reasonable. If I go back to Operations Manager and I go to the delete, you'll see now that there's an instance already created. Now this is, it had an old one hanging around, but let's see here. I'll delete this one. So this is the one that it just created, and then we should also have a renewal here. It's got two renewals because I was running this over again, but I'll delete this one, the older one. So the most recent one here is this one here at 451. So now I have this validation configured, and so this particular workflow, what it's going to do, I'm just going to jump back in Automation Studio and give you a little bit of a preview just to show you how that's going to work. So when we start the renewal, what will happen is we will basically just create a ServiceNow incident, and it will also send an email and notify the requester that, hey, you need to renew this. Now, if we look at Operations Manager here, you'll notice that in this case, the renewal time is scheduled for 12/7/2024. So we got a ways to go to wait for that, and certainly the webinar itself isn't gonna last that long. So we can, if we want, run this manually. So we could simply just do this. So we'll just create a manual trigger here. Save the change. Okay, and so now we'll just run this manually. So we'll sort of pretend that this particular instance has already expired, is due to expire. So if I pick this one here and run it, so it started the renewal process, and it actually sent me an email. So if I go over here and look, you'll see here that I just got this email. So if I double click on this, it's basically telling me, hey, your service is about to expire in 10 days. And here's what was configured. And also says a ServiceNow incident has been created. And if you want to extend it, you have to you indicate that by changing the state to in progress. Now, ideally, we could have done something more that took a little bit longer and put a specific field in an incident or something like that. But in this case, we'll just, all we need to really do is to set this state to in progress. So if I click on the link here, should bring up my incident. And it's going to want me to change my caller. And now again, you'll see here, it's put a message in the incident telling us again, repeating that same process. Now, in this case here, we also have, the Itential, so in the ServiceNow store, there's an Itential app. And so it's the Itential Automation Services app, and that's actually deployed in our ServiceNow instance. And so this app makes it really easy to build Oracle flow. To build ServiceNow flows and actions by calling actions that are exposed by the Itential app here. So the Itential app is configured to dynamically discover any endpoints that exist in the product, and so it knows about my endpoint, and so it can actually invoke it. Someone actually created a flow in ServiceNow. It took about 10 minutes for the guy that did it. So it's not terribly complicated. It's not really any coding involved. It's pretty straightforward. And what you'll notice here is that the short description of the incident is basically access service and then the name. And so when I change the state of this, it's actually going to invoke the renew endpoint. So if I were to look in Itential Operations Manager and you look in renew, there's an endpoint here. I think looks like it's not here either. So let's see, we can create one. Call it API. Well, let's call it so we'll create the endpoint. We'll just call it access. No. So I'll just save this. And this will define the endpoint that ServiceNow is actually going to call. So now you can see that there's an endpoint already existing here. So as long as ServiceNow hits this API endpoint, then we'll invoke the renew operation here. So now, as I mentioned, the way to kick that off is the flow that we have will detect the change in status. So when it goes from new to in progress, so if I hit update, we should see this trigger. So I go back to Operations Manager quickly. I don't know if I'll be able to get there before this does. Let's see. You'll see it already kind of ran really quickly here, but you can see here, this is the renew endpoint right here that's running, and it went through and took a few steps. So we'll just look at the workflow. So it ran right here, and the proof of that is if I go back to that incident, you'll see now that the state of that is resolved. So once the user changed the state to in progress, that caused the ServiceNow flow to run, which called our API, and it gave us enough data to figure out which LCM instance is impacted, and it went off and should have triggered a renewal. So if I went back to Operations Manager here, so let's see, and you'll see that the delete here, you'll see now what you can tell here is just by the timestamp that the delete's been updated. So it basically decided, okay, I'm going to reschedule that, and it actually added a few days to it, I think. So you'll see the reschedule here, and then we should also see the renew endpoint again, the start renewal again. So you'll see there's another endpoint created that was just created just a moment ago. So now we've actually been able to go through that renewal process, and we have a way to actually involve the requesting entity via ServiceNow. So if you have customers that are, or people that are consuming services, if they're able to log in and access ServiceNow, which is pretty common, they can actually help drive this. Like I said, we just did this by having a flow that changed based on the state changing from new to in progress, and that's good enough to do it here. But maybe if you did something more custom, you might want to add a field or something like that. And then later on, you'll see that it basically said it extended it successfully and gave the resolution code and closed it out. So just a little bit of a demonstration about how, in summary, you can actually track state and what value that might provide for you, right? So you can imagine, if you just have a Python script to do some of these things, like to go off and provision something, it's going to be really hard to get that to figure out how to get that requester back in a certain amount of time to revalidate any of this. And so that's what The value that Itential Lifecycle Manager is providing is our ability now to track some state for those services, and it makes it a little bit easier and cleaner for us to then revalidate that they're needed. We don't have to do things like, well, is anyone hitting that rule or anything like that? We're just going to make some policy-based determinations based on duration. We'll give someone a chance to renew it. If they don't renew it, that deletion trigger that we have will eventually fire and remove it. So if no one takes action for 10 days, then it will get removed and they'll have to re-request it. But what we won't do is have a lot of lingering configuration that we're not sure if we can remove or not. So just one way to sort of attack the problem. And that's it. That's all I had for today's demo. And let's the slides back up here. And thanks everyone for listening in, and see you next time.